It has been reported in the Telegraph that during the pandemic, the government worked in tandem with social media companies to try and silence critics of its lockdown policies. This so-called counter-disinformation unit was designed to tackle domestic threats and secretly monitored critics of the government, with their social media posts apparently being blocked from being widely circulated. Author Michael Shellenberger joins me now to discuss this. Michael, welcome to Free Speech Nation.
Good to be with you, Andrew.
Michael, you were one of the journalists that was entrusted to leak the Twitter files in the US. Could you just tell us a bit about that? Because over there we saw that there was evidence, wasn't there, of some kind of collusion between the US authorities and the social media giants.
Sure. So what we discovered in the Twitter files is extremely similar to what occurred in Great Britain, as reported by the Telegraph yesterday, but also had been previously reported in what I believe the Telegraph had called the lockdown files, including emails from one of your government ministers, Hancock, to Facebook executive Nick Clegg. Very similar dynamic here, with White House officials putting direct pressure on Facebook to censor what Facebook called often true posts, including around posts around vaccine side effects that they feared would cause vaccine hesitancy. In the Twitter files, we discovered that there was a large operation run by U.S. government agencies, including Department of Homeland Security, that interacted with private sector NGOs that then flagged social media posts, disfavored social media posts that they wanted Twitter and Facebook to censor, and they reported very high levels of compliance, somewhere between 20 and 50%. Compliance. And what was really satisfying about the Telegraph reporting yesterday is that it verified that everything that we had found had also occurred in Britain. I mean, that's not good news, but it had come at a time when people were suggesting that what we had discovered was very innocent government flagging of social media posts and not censorship. I think what you see in both countries is very heavy-handed pressure by governments on the social media companies to censor these disfavored views, many of which were
among some of the Twitter files that were released, there were emails that were showing how members of the Democrat Party were flagging certain tweets saying, could we deal with these, take these down? To be fair, the Republicans were at it as well. But of course, because Silicon Valley didn't align with the Republican worldview, not as many of those were actioned. I mean, this kind of thing is incredibly serious, isn't it? And why is it the case that this did not get as much coverage as it ought to have done in the media? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think the media is part of the problem in many cases. It's part of what you would call the censorship industrial complex, which I should add, we are coming to Britain on June 22nd at 7 p.m. in Central Hall, Westminster, to expose at greater length, in part because we think that the United States and Great Britain have historically defended free speech as people of English-speaking nations that have a significant role in shaping how governments around the world think about this, how people around the world think about this. So I think that the media has really failed. I was extremely happy to see the Telegraph's reporting. I think that the story will increasingly come out because it's clear there was a major government effort in the United States, in Great Britain, across the EU, and it's now happening around the world where there has been significant censorship over the last 3 years of disfavored views that were often very accurate, including telling people's personal experiences of an experimental drug's side effect, one that we might think had more benefits than harms. And I certainly took the vaccine myself, but nonetheless, it's been in the public interest to fight for knowing the side effects of drugs over the last several decades. So to see the media just play cheerleader while accepting significant amounts of money. You may know Pfizer invested many tens of millions of dollars in advertising, which all those media companies took. And then, of course, they have a direct competitive interest in not allowing alternative media, where in social media, they want the advertising money for themselves. So I think there was a lot of reasons why the advertisers, or why the mainstream news media have ignored the story to date.
But in a sense, you can understand, and I don't approve of it, but you can understand websites like YouTube and places that are themselves have an ideological point of view, censoring certain things that don't align with it. It's completely wrong, but you know where they're coming from. Why? But when it comes to a government, I mean, you're describing a worldwide trend among governments to actually limit the scope of potential conversations. Why would that be the case? Why won't governments accept that more discussion about these things is best?
Well, it certainly appears that in English language nations, including Britain and the United States, really after 2016, there, in the wake of Brexit and the election of Trump, there was an effort by military and intelligence organizations in both Britain and the United States, including NGOs that they work very closely with, to work with to basically demand greater censorship. And they were doing it through various causes. So it included election denialism in the United States. It's included COVID vaccines and also COVID origins. It's included now the war in Ukraine, which, whatever you think of it, we should have a free debate about. It's included climate change. And now the latest thing is so-called hate speech, which we have shown that there is really no evidence that any incidents of hate on any significant levels are increasing in the Western world. But yet in all of these countries, Britain, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, the excuse is being used that there is more hate online as a way to demand greater censorship. So we see basically elites looking for reasons to justify greater censorship. In some ways, it gives the sense that the ultimate goal is just to have a censorship apparatus that they have greater control over, and they're using these issues in order to establish that apparatus.
I mean, the way you say that, it sounds like you think this has been designed this way. I mean, my feeling might be that it might be just well-intentioned people getting it really wrong. I mean, the name of this unit was the Disinformation Unit. And what if these people have actually believed themselves that this stuff is disinformation, that these things are not up for debate? Or do you think it's more sinister than that?
Well, there's definitely an organic element of self-censorship that you've documented and we've documented here in the United States. This organic demand that people use particular pronouns, for example, that people use language in particular ways that can sometimes be quite ridiculous. That's a very real phenomenon that comes from the culture. I don't think anybody doubts that that's real. But what we have also seen is government agencies, certainly in the United States, using that sort of what you might call cultural wokeism, a kind of political correctness, particularly around so-called hate speech, race, but also climate change, certainly COVID and election denialism, and using those justifications for censorship, just because you're looking, if you want to justify censorship, you have to point to real world harm. And so what that cultural wokeism does is it provides what you might call a predicate for censorship, and they keep seeking out new predicates.
Isn't it interesting, though, that anyone who knows anything about the history of censorship knows full well that the very worst thing you can do with bad ideas is to suppress them, because they fester and they grow. And I've seen some pretty crazy conspiracy theories regarding the COVID pandemic. But if anything, these things, it strikes me, have proliferated precisely because these kind of reports come out showing that governments have been curtailing speech. What do you think of that?
Well, certainly there's something called the Barbra Streisand effect, because when she tried to prevent the publication of photos of her house in California, everybody wanted to look at the photographs. I also would point out that there is no movement for human liberation in the history of humankind, whether from slavery or the women's right to vote or any civil rights movement, that has ever demanded censorship. It's always been the opposite. They've always demanded their right to speak. So to see groups that are claiming to want censorship in the name of human freedom or of democracy, you know that they are obviously totalitarian or authoritarian at a minimum in their intentions, and that those aren't good intentions. Those are poor intentions. And so I think we're at risk of seeing a kind of, psychopathology that's been in the culture for a long time being taken advantage of by some state actors with taxpayer money to demand that we not be allowed for ourselves what information we should decide to believe and not believe, which has been the tradition in our countries for over 250 years.
But given that we're now in the digital age, how can we possibly tackle this? I mean, it looks like the only way we can do so is if we rely on the world's richest people to buy up platforms and force them to accept free speech and to leak the documents that show the extent of the suppression that was going on. But there's only one Elon Musk, and this isn't going to happen again and again. I mean, is this a sort of lost cause?
Well, we don't think so. I think that, the most important thing is that the vast majority of people in the United States and in Britain, and I believe around the world, would like to have very strong free speech protections like we have in the United States, where we have a First Amendment. We do not allow the government to regulate speech. It's a very strong level of protection. We think that that ought to be the standard worldwide, that the social media companies must take that standard worldwide, and that the content moderation decisions that they inevitably make should simply be reported, since more speech is the solution, not less speech or censorship. And so we are, as I mentioned, building a free speech movement around the world. Many of the people that you would have thought that would have been on the side of more free speech have actually been demanding censorship, sadly and ironically. And so we are coming to London on June 22nd to the 23rd. We're doing an event at 7 p.m. on June 22nd with Russell Brand at Central Hall, Westminster, to really build this movement, because really the United States and Britain are the heart of the global movement that's existed for hundreds of years to demand greater free speech rights. And we want to see citizens demanding very high First Amendment levels of free speech for all of our countries around the world, whether they're in the West and English speaking, or they're in places like India and Turkey, which are also governments demanding censorship. So we think ultimately there needs to be a citizens movement.
Well, this sounds very, very important to me. I'm glad to hear you're coming to London June 22nd. I think people should definitely go along if they're able to do so. Michael Shellenberger, thanks ever so much for joining me.
Thanks very much, Andrew.